Alright, let's start with political issues circa uh, 1900 to 1914. Firstly, what was England like in the 1900s? Britain faced import duties. The British economy was lagging behind USA and Germany, following even a little bit further back, the kind of second industrial revolution. Society was largely conservative, and so was government. The restricted franchise. Society was sexist. There was a strong established elite aristocracy. Imperialism was rife in society and the empire. Let's talk about the Conservative government under Balfour. This is 1902 to 1905. In the 1902 Election Act, under Balfour, only funded Catholic and Church of England schools, which pissed off the nonconformists. The 1901 Taff Vale judgment was continued, restricting trade unions' ability to strike without repercussions. The Chinese slave controversy happened in South Africa following the Boer War. They had Chinese people in the mines. In 1903, Joseph Chamberlain announces that he has a support for tariffs, which split the Conservative Party, and this split was made even further by the fact that Balfour's position at this time on tariffs was completely unclear. And the Aliens Act of 1905 led to high levels of Jewish immigration, which, I don't know, might have made a little bit of uncertainty in society or whatever, but it's not really talked about much in the textbook. Let's talk about reasons for the Liberal landslide. 223 seats were gained by the Liberals, and then they had 9 of them unseated, so 223 is the main figure there. It was the Conservative plus Liberal Unionist kind of group gained 5 seats, but 251 were unseated. And then, interestingly enough, Labour had 29 seats. In December 1905, Balfour resigned as PM to allow Bannerman to form a minority government. The reasons for this were the Conservatives were divided on tariff reform. The trade unions strongly opposed the Conservatives and were damaging Conservatives' abilities to make changes in workplace and that. The Lib-Lab Pact gave Liberals extra left-wing unionist support. The Taff Vale judgment had made strikes illegitimate. Not impossible, but illegitimate. The Boer War's failings appeared like a disaster in the headlines, and then Chinese slavery followed that. There were concentration camps created for the Dutch resistance in the Boer War. The Conservatives had no support whatsoever in Wales, and Scotland was very liberal as well. Now let's talk about the origins of the Labour Party and the trade unions. Factors leading to the growth of Labour Party included Clause 4, which was written by Sidney and Beatrice Webb in their new constitution. MacDonald being replaced by Henderson to keep Labour, quote-unquote, in with those in favour of the war, because MacDonald was pacifist. The support for the League of Nations in what they called their Memorandum on War Aims. So they weren't just seen as some like socialist crazies, they actually cared about international and foreign policy. They had a greater awareness for poverty in this period than other parties, following people like Gout, Booth and Rowntree going to these different places in that. In 1889, the Trade Union Congress expanded to 2 million members. Keir Hardie led the first independent Labour Party in 1889. Uh, in 1900, the Labour Representative Committee was formed, which was an alliance of trade unions and socialist groups. And the Lib Lab Pact helped strengthen the Labour Party as well. The Employers Federation grew in 1885, which resulted in further trade union membership. In 1897 to 98, there were lockouts of workers from their jobs and their payments, so that riled up more trade union activism, and the Conservatives didn't really change anything to help the workers. So let's talk about the constitutional crisis. Who was to blame? Was the House of Lords to blame for the constitutional crisis? Well, they had been selfish and anti-democratic in their actions on the topic. Their strategic mistakes in rejecting the budget rather than the additional following bills was also a mistake on their part. But you could also argue, on the other hand, Balfour created a crisis for pushing for too extreme a budget in the People's Budget that he had proposed. You could argue that it was inevitable as the public was becoming increasingly politically conscious. Now, what were the things proposed in the People's Budget? You could say the increase in inheritance tax, the incomes over £5,000 were given the new income tax. There was a new tax on motor vehicles. There was a new land tax, and a new way of valuing land, so new land valuation. There were duties on liquor businesses and alcohol and tobacco taxes rise as well. David Lloyd George used this inevitable win to his advantage and saw the Parliament Act pushed through. So it was good for David Lloyd George. Now, talking about women's suffrage in 1906 to 1914, there was a passive campaign that hadn't really paid off. So both moderate and radical suffragists and suffragettes chose to increase their efforts. The success of Irish and trade unions impassioned women's rights groups. Lloyd George personally opposed the 1908 Women's Rights Bill. The Liberal government used negative rhetoric around the militancy of suffragists and suffragettes, who were more militant than suffragists, were critiqued heavily in the newspaper for damaging holdings in Belfast and London and setting a hall in Belfast on fire. And we've got one more point here. In Ireland, the situation in Ireland, there was a second Home Rule bill in 1893. The land problem was those who rented could be charged extortionate rates. The Irish Parliamentary Party in 1874 to 1918 was the first major Irish nationalist party, and they gained the vast majority of the votes. The Home Rule bills couldn't pass without the Parliament Act, so they didn't really have true Home Rule. And between 1910 to 1914, the Ulster Volunteers formed openly carrying their arms, which was met by the Dublin Volunteers carrying their arms. And because of all this tension, Churchill considered deploying an army in Belfast as civil war potentially loomed. Now onto the topic of social issues between 1900 and 1918. So the development of New Liberalism is the first kind of social subheading. New Liberalism focused on the pursuit of keeping people free from poverty through the means of state intervention. They wanted to establish a national minimum standard of living. They recognized the dangers of striking to laissez-faire policy was too great. They also argued that their members, including Gladstone, believed that old liberalism was had to give way to new liberalism. Lloyd George and Churchill were kind of on the side of new liberalism, but they were both using it to their advantage, really, to gain public notoriety and popularity. In terms of Lloyd George, he went to Germany to see Europe's most developed social welfare system. He was concerned with socialism, so he wanted to find a good middle ground, and he wanted to undercut the appeal of the Labour Party, whereas Winston Churchill was also concerned with socialism. He was concerned with the health and strength of the British race. He wanted to provide a lifebelt to the poor rather than a comprehensive policy of state support. So that's kind of the ideas of new liberalism. The new consensus resulted in Chamberlain creating the Liberal Unionists with the Conservatives. So let's talk about the debate over poverty and national efficiency. On the topic of the debate over poverty, people were arguing about how to best to deal with poverty. People were talking about how the Commission on the Poor Law had met to discuss from 1905 to 1909, and there was no really great conclusion come to until a little bit later. Some argued for greater state intervention, but others argued that this would undermine charities. Some said that intervention would halt savings of the responsible poor, quote unquote. This was because poverty was seen as a moral issue rather than the outcome of unfortunate circumstances. Helen Bossuet, Bosaquet, was of this view. And the majority report of the Commission came to the conclusion that if state intervention was too much, it would become an enabling state for illness, thriftlessness, and vice, rather than virtue. And then the debate over national efficiency. This followed the concerns that Britain was falling behind on the international field in the 1880s. The British racial strength and empire were also being weakened by poor health and urban problems. Promotion of greater health and welfare for the poor would ensure Britain's racial superiority. This bred into concerns and a desire for eugenics following Germany's overtaking of Britain in the way of the armies and manufacturing realms. Right. On education and young people, in 1870 there was an act that had created local school boards to ensure that church schools would step in where there were no more state schools. So this formed elementary schools. In the 1880s, technical schools and local councils were created grants for such students. The 1902 Education Act established 2,500 school boards. Abolished, 2,500 school boards and 114 new local education authorities LEAS, which we still have today, were created by county councils. This Education Act gave old independent grammar schools grants to take more poorer children, and new state secondaries were also built. The problems of the 1902 Act were that non-conformist schools were comparatively underfunded, and there was still pressure on children to support their families and go get a job. Then there was the 1918 Education Act, in which the leaving age was raised to 14. There were more medical inspections made provision for. Some of the negatives about this was that the quality of education wasn't always high, and the lack of reduced poverty hardly affected the reality of the leaving ages. So even though it's said that people were going to leave at 14, people might have just chosen to leave early or whatever. In the Children's Act of 1908, there was established juvenile courts rather than sending children to prisons filled with adults as well. This created infant borstalls, but this law later developed into social services and orphanages. And by 1914, there were 1,000 new secondaries and 349 of these were secondary girls' schools. Now on the topic of old age pensions, reasons for why people wanted old age pensions. Firstly, the Poor Law forced the elderly looking for help into workhouses, which was humiliating and demeaning. Reformers like Charles Booth advocated a pension for the elderly. On the other hand, Chamberlain believed that this would take away from the deterrent of the workhouses. In 1906, the election led many Labour and Liberal MPs advocating pensions. So existing charities were resistant to the state interference and argued that it would reduce family responsibility of looking after their elders. The impact of the old age pensions meant that they were only made to those with less than £31 a year in income. Those who had received from the Poor Law previously were not eligible. Most poor people didn't live very long after 70 anyway, so it only ensured a small percentage of the population, and couples were forced to claim less because they were seen as two people who could provide better for themselves off of each other. But by 1914, 970,000 had achieved elderly pensions. On the topic of national insurance as a social issue, it was introduced in... when was it introduced? In 1911, Lloyd George was able to introduce national insurance. It meant that workers were compelled to pay into it for healthcare if they earned under £160 a year. Workers would be paying for 4 days a week. The employers would add 3 and the state would add 2. So it spread the cost quite evenly, which covered the workers but not their families, and it was able to support the insured worker for the maximum of 13 weeks. Why was national insurance implemented? It focused on getting people back to work as quickly as possible. It saved money in the long term. It aimed at protecting workers who had worked in industry that could leave the workers underemployed, so like shipbuilding industry and that, dockhand industry, industries that changed because of mechanization. If the workers were laid off, this would protect them from casual work, previously mentioned, and similar schemes in Germany had also worked to good avail. The poor laws were outdated, so they needed some replacement with the national insurance, and there were concerns for national efficiency, which were appeased by this sort of, and there was a growing belief in state intervention at this time as well. Now let's talk about the measures to protect workers. Let's talk about the successful measures first. There had been a fulfillment of new liberal awareness to prevent exploitation of workers. In 1906, the Workmen's Compensation Act brought on an additional 6 million under compensation for industrial incidents. In 1909, the Trade Boards Bill, partly proposed by Winston Churchill, created regulatory boards for workers, employers, and the state in relation to sweated industries, which was like heavy manual labour. Let's talk about the unsuccessful measures to protect workers. Firstly, we've got let's talk about the unsuccessful measures to protect workers. These included they could have caused a spike in unemployment and pushed up costs with all the insurance and that, but it didn't really in reality. Certain viewers didn't like the 1908 restrictions to only 8 work hours a day. So miners didn't like that because they wanted to get in the mine more and make more money because they were paid on like commission. It didn't cover more than 250,000 people initially, talking about the Trade Boards Bill, 1909, and there was no take-up on the suggestion of an established minimum wage, and by any of these governments between 1900 and 1918, and that was a bit. That's it. So this is Britain at war between 1914 and 1918. Firstly, let's talk about the different attitudes to war. People, the positive side is the invasion of Belgium showed the British that they had the moral duty to go to war, and people were enthused by that. There was a sense that a war would unite the British public, which some of the politicians liked. It would promote national efficiency through fitness, getting people fit. They predicted it would be an easy win with France and Russia on their side. People believed that it would help to unite Ireland. The formation of PALS battalions made people's outlook to war a lot more optimistic. The home front remained fairly determined to fight on throughout the war. On the other hand, though, you have the negative outlook, which included nearly all of Britain's skilled army was replaced by volunteers by 1950, so that's 1 year into the war. Britain hadn't fought a European war since 1850, so they weren't really ready for this type of conflict. it became more apparent after seeing 1915 that the war wouldn't be a short and easy one. Some socialists believed that they could prevent a war by showing solidarity with their German counterpart workers. The Quakers opposed the war entirely, and Ramsay MacDonald opposed the war, but he stepped down for Arthur Henderson during the time. Let's talk about how great an impact did the war have on the home front. Main aspects. The Ministry of Munitions, which was established in 1915, took over factories and created its own munitions, and it was headed by Lloyd George, who was the Minister for Munitions. The railway and mines were temporarily nationalised during the war, and shipping could be requisitional. Sugar, meat, butter and jam were rationed in 1918. Pub opening times were restricted, and the buying of rounds was made illegal, so you could only buy a couple of drinks. In May 1916, the British summertime was invented for the timings system. The blackouts were introduced when there was the danger of air raids. There was the censorship of press and of telegrams, which began. Land use was regulated and enforced to yield more food. There was improved conditions in munitions factories. Government propaganda became rife. The nation's health by 1914 meant that many men were unfit for war, which is a negative. Food supplies were being destroyed by German U-boats and submarines. Inadequate living rose vastly during this period. There were separation payments for those who lost loved ones in the war, or those who were just in the war. Widows' pensions were based on the serviceman's that they were married to rank. Disability allowances for those too disabled to return to the war were made. School meals for the poor were made yearly rather than termly, so more people got free school meals for a bit. There was major risk in volunteering work. Despite this, 30,000 people volunteered in London in 1914. The Volunteers Corps became the forerunner of the 1940s Dad's Army. Let's talk about why was there a coalition government in 1915, and why did Lloyd George become PM in 1916? Firstly, the Conservatives were too actively focused on the war. Labour was split on pacifism and being pro-war. Turkey, the situation in Gallipoli against Turkey meant that Churchill became unpopular. The Unionists were had criticised shell shortages prior to the failures in Gallipoli, as well as the backbench Conservatives, and then it all went up in flames and they had more to complain about. Following Churchill's mistakes in Turkey, Asquith decided to create a coalition government. Asquith was still PM in this coalition government. Kitchener was still Minister for War. Churchill was replaced as First Lord of the Admiralty with Balfour. Arthur Henderson was symbolically brought in as the Minister for Education. In the coalition of 1916 and Lloyd George, as both Minister of Munitions and Minister for War, Lloyd George had been proven capable in his roles. He was more popular than Asquith, and less a part of the old establishment than again Asquith was. the backbench Conservatives and Liberals seemed to like him a bit more than Asquith. The trade unions and Labour were more open to a person like Lloyd George in government than Asquith. The reasons and significance of the Liberal split by 1918. So Lloyd George pursued policies of greater state intervention, which put him at odds with the traditional Liberals. There were also disagreements about his introduction of conscription to Ireland in 1918, as well as his support for the extension of the franchise. On top of this, Lloyd George allied with the Tories, but continually submitted to Labour's demands, which furthered the split. There was an even further split when the Marine debate came to light, and Asquith pursued an inquiry and parliamentary vote. Labour became increasingly appealing to the New Liberals, so New Liberals kind of wanted to shift to Labour, and Lloyd George eventually became a leader without a party by 1918, which increased as he suppressed Irish Home Rule and Labour's influence grew. Let's talk about Labour Party 1918 and the new constitution. Clause 4 was added to the Labour Party manifesto by Beatrice and Sidney Webb. Labour left the coalition in 1918 and Willie Adamson was temporarily made the leader. The new organisation of the party was more appealing. Its leaders had achieved cabinet ranks but previously, so they weren't just unknowns. They benefited from trade union expansion. They increased their own popular vote, and they now had 57 seats by 1918. They found they kind of were the alternative to the Liberal Party, which was divided, and they were united. Their new progressive foreign policy was accepted by most, and this all helped build towards the 1922 election result. How significant were the changes in the role of women during the war, and how far did these changes lead to the extension of the franchise for women in 1918? The granting of the right for women to vote in and stand for parliamentary elections had been seen as a result of their work in the war. However, at the time, and subsequently, this has been challenged. In some ways, women were making progress towards gaining the franchise before the war. The war faced a change in the number of men eligible to vote. So that's over 21s, and women over 30 were included in the extension of the franchise following February 1918. However, younger women who had done the most for the war effort were excluded until 1928. Henderson suggested the extension of the franchise to men over 21 following the war, and this helped open up the conversation about women's role in society and their potential to vote. Suffrage groups focused on women's needs during the time of the war and helped spur on female volunteers for factories. There were 117,000 female employees in transport during the war, and women, especially married women, became more financially independent as they worked. Separation allowances were made, and women were more likely to drive as well as this. And that is Britain at War. Alright, so now we're going to be talking about British politics from 1918 to 1924. First, let's discuss the coupon election. In this election, the coalition Conservatives gained a huge majority, so there was no longer a need for Lloyd George. Despite this, they kept him anyway. So Lloyd George was made a Conservative puppet. There were over 260 new MPs who were businessmen and industrialists elected. Sinn Féin gained many seats in Ireland. The Liberal split became fatal. The reasons why they kept him following the war was because he had been popular following the war, like in munitions and Minister for War. The coalition previously had met its promises after 1916, which is why it stuck together and was why it was held so highly in public regard. They had extended the franchise to householders, which is why they ended up getting 32.5% of the vote overall. Talking about the Conservatives there. That's the coupon election. We can talk about equal citizenship in 1920s. So the Flapper Act enfranchised women between 21 and 30 in 1928. Divorce laws were equalised in 1923. The sex discrimination the Sex Discrimination Removal Act meant that women could work in law now without being fired just on the basis of being a woman. Let's talk about success of Lloyd George coalition between 1918 and 1922. Let's talk about the foreign policy. They had a key role at Versailles, such as restrictions on the German fleet and the colonies being redistributed. In terms of foreign policy, it was a bit of a mess. Apart from that, for example, you could say in the mandates, Japanese nationalism hadn't, or maybe wasn't able to have been had a credible opposition to it because of all the other fighting that was going on. In the Balfour Declaration, there were tensions rising in Palestine. In terms of peace treaties, Germany had growing nationalism. France took the Rhine, and the League of Nations lacked US support, so it was all a bit of a shambles there. In terms of the Chanak crisis, there was conflict between Greece and Turkey, which was seen as a manufactured crisis to rally conservative support for Lloyd George. The post-war settlement with Japan was once again a failure. The two treaties, in terms of Ireland, meant that Ulster was given home rule, which was part of the Government of Ireland Act, but this is not what they wanted, this is what the rest of Ireland wanted. And other policies in Ireland included the 1918 Irish Parliament declared, Lloyd George and Liberals now had to not support Home Rule following this. So there was two hardline British policies, that being the first and then the second being the unpopularity of conscription in Ireland had led to radical nationalism spurring up again in 1918. Alright, let's talk about Some social policies of Lloyd George. Um, Maternity and Child Welfare Act in 1918 was good for people. There was the Old Age Pension Act, making pension provisions. There was the National Insurance Act and the Unemployment Act. All good things in terms of social policies, I reckon. Now let's talk about the Conservative recovery. In terms of reasons for it, Liberal traditional voters didn't want to vote Labour. Mostly women at the time were voting for Conservatives. There was a left-wing split between Liberals and Labour. Baldwin was effective against Lord George. In terms of Baldwin, he was bad, arguably, as he reduced defence spending which arguably led to 1930s 1930s peace appeasement with Hitler, under Chamberlain. But despite this, he was wise, as he didn't end free trade, and he made Churchill Chancellor of the Exchequer. But arguably, you could say that this backfired because the decision to put the pound on or off gold resulted in the help of financial industries because they put it off gold, but it damaged manufacturing massively, which was a massive blunder, and arguably resulted in 1 million on the dole by 1923. He was again an adept user of broadcast. Reasons for Conservative recovery, we've talked about that. Foreign policy. There was a lack of alliances and strong military, which made the treaties such as the Locarno Pact hard to maintain. There was a bit of a shambles in terms of the Liberal Party, and then also the Kellogg-Brienne Pact, which outlined war, was merely good intentions. It was just kind of show. And we have Neville Chamberlain, who was the Minister for Health at the time. He wanted to promote an alternative for socialism, and he had a 4-year plan of 25 proposed acts, 22 of which got passed. Widows, orphans, and old age pension acts were passed sort of through him. And that's why the Conservatives recovered during this period. Let's talk about the decline of the Liberal Party in this period. Firstly, we have the rise of Labour as the alternative. Lloyd George foreign policy mistakes, the wartime split, the extension of the franchise backfired, their outdated beliefs, the coupon election split, the traditional supporters better represented by other parties, so Conservatives and Labour, impact of war on liberal beliefs, so views changed and people became more open to state welfare. People arguably said that Liberal Party was arguably not representative of any solid economic group in society or a majority. Now let's talk about Labour's aims during the period. Aims and achievements. So its aims were to tackle foreign and domestic issues. So they wanted to achieve world peace, get more involved with the League of Nations, more houses, reduction on duties and imports for unemployment. They wanted to solve the rural crisis. Using something called the Dan's solution. Oh, the Dawes solution, the Dawes plan, where they got the Americans to come in and sort it out. This was the first Labour government in 1922, by the way. Sorry for not mentioning that. They opened up trade treaty with the USSR, which some people liked, but because it's beneficial, but some people didn't like because it just was bad face for the government. At home, policies at home. There were agricultural wage boards were formed, but nothing really happened out of that. The Unemployment Insurance Act created and increased more benefits. The Housing Act meant that there were 5,000 new council homes built. In terms of the fall, the reasons for the Labour Party's fall, you could say the Zinoviev letter, which is a fake letter written from like the Russian like communist group or whatever. The Workers' Weekly controversy, in which a reporter called for troops not to act against the strikes, and then the MacDonald allowed for the guy to be free from prison, and then he had a vote of confidence. He let a vote of confidence be passed through following Liberals abusing it in debates, and the Labour Party won anyway. Okay, now let's talk about why did Lloyd George fall from power before the Labour success. Let's talk about this. Inconsistency in foreign policy, intervention in Russia had failed, the Conservatives disliked Irish policy, the Newport by-election that they had lost in, and he lived openly with his mistress. Now let's talk about the 1923 election. So firstly, free trade. Baldwin wanted to increase duties on imported goods to reduce unemployment, and would get support of this through an election. And this backfired and resulted in this election was between 1922 and then 1923, by the way. So the rise of Labour and the fall of the Liberals. See, I've been talking about a while ago about all the different aims and achievements of Labour, but you can also say that although outwardly socialist, MacDonald didn't want hard nationalisation, which was good for Labour's appearance at the time. The result and significance of the 1923 election was that Conservatives and Baldwin won, but the Liberals still had 158 seats despite the splits, and Labour then became the second largest party, sort of priming them to bounce back into leadership later on. And that's British politics. Now on to the next topic, economic issues between 1918 and 1939. So post-war economic conditions is the first subheading. After a post-war boom, the British economy faced a long period from 1920 to 1939 of high unemployment and problems in the selling of products of its staple industries. So let's talk about the impact of war. Following the war, it was required considerable economic effort, and despite this, taxation was only at 25p in the pound, so that wasn't really enough. The war was financed by borrowing and increases in many economic who knows? Foreign and Dominion allies offered 2,000 million pounds in support, and the war saw full employment. This is the post-war boom. Despite the influenza epidemic, there was a boom. Pensions and payments to ex-servicemen put lots of money in the economy. 17,000 new agricultural small holdings were established. Exports stood at 1,585 million pounds in 1920, having been only 637 million in 1913. And then the long-term impact of the war was that demand fell in economies, while in other countries it recovered. And then there was an increase in mechanization, and manufacturing prices fell industry-wide. There was less money across the world to buy British produce and products, and then the USA was excelling in nearly all markets as a global competitor to the UK. Let's talk about 2 problems of the staple industries. The problems of overproduction, high production costs, and devaluing markets hit the coal industry particularly hard. The solution of nationalising the industry or making considerable changes was rejected by government. Coal had obstinate and selfish owners, while the unions had a strong socialist agenda. Coal, iron, cotton, steel, and what was the vast majority of Britain's workforce in the staple industries. Talking about the problems of the staple industries, firstly, foreign competition. German manufacturers were protected by tariffs in a way that Britain's wouldn't be until 1932. The American economy and exports boomed and was cheaper. Russia, Italy, and Japan all grew their manufacturing capabilities as part of a second industrial revolution, and their practices were more streamlined and updated. The British economy shifted to more financial services such as investment, and the 1929 crash resulted in coal exports dropping by 66% due to a lack of ships, and there was a 40% decrease in iron production from 1913 to 1929, while India sort of finessed the cotton market. And the third topic, economic unrest. A coal strike in 1926 led to a general strike as the Trade Union Congress reluctantly supported an overall withdrawal of labour. The strike did not command the support of all workers thanks to considerable government preparation and a failure of the main labour movement to carry the conflict to its extremes, and it ended after only 9 days. The strike resulted in a weakening of trade union power and generally lower wages. However, as prices were falling, hardship was reduced, though it remained a feature of working class life for many. The strike was the climax of long trade union growth to 8.4 million members by 1920. The unions were more organised as a product of amalgamation. So there was the Amalgamated Engineering Union, formed in 1920, the Transport and General Workers Union, formed in 1921, and the General and Municipal Workers Union, formed in 1924. The Trade Union Congress created a National Joint Council within Labour in 1921, and 50% of mine workers were cut following the general strike. The government set aside £10 million in subsidy for the miners in kind of provisions to prepare for the waves of the strikes, which is more than enough. Then topic 4 is the impact of the Great Depression. The world's economic slump in 1929 hit on an already dwindling British economy, and 1932 was an exceptionally bad year. Economic problems brought an end to the second Labour government in 1931, and the national government, attempting to defend the pound, was forced to devalue and go off the gold standard in September 1931. Let's talk about industry. The Great Depression did not permanently harm British industrial output, as seen in the 46% rise in industrial production from 1932 to 1937. In 1932, Britain became Europe's largest producer of cars, and by 1937 there were 400,000 private cars on British roads. Let's talk about social impacts. The house building boom helped by low interest rates, which allowed relatively cheap borrowing to finance the building, and home buyers to get mortgages. Despite this, there were 3 million unemployed, so 22% of the usual workforce, which resulted in the formation of the national government and a rise by 46% in industrial action. Now, topic 5, let's talk about unemployment in the interwar period. Causes. One of the causes was old industries, hurt by a fall in demand and a fall in prices. The old economy was being phased out of for newer industry, and then newer industries were not strong enough to yet solve the unemployment or adopt the mass manufacturing model that the USA had. They were also producing overpriced consumer goods, so rising real wages did not lead to the booming consumer goods, as these newer industries produced goods that were too dear, like radios and whatever. Lack of mobility was another cause, as old workers were reluctant to leave their hometowns. So the unemployment in the interwar period resulted in the Holidays with Pay Act in 1938, which encouraged paid holidays, but didn't enforce them, and then the Factory Act in 1937, which extended regulations to smaller workshops and factories in areas of safety, heating and lighting. Then we have the regional variation on this topic. Areas where work was available saw an increase in the standards of living. Real wages rose from 17% from 1931 to 1937, giving better access to health insurance and pensions. Rowntree found that York in 1935 had 1/3 of the population below the poverty line. Now let's talk about 6. Economic policies of the national government. Government policies had to deal with the continuing depression. Government policies to deal with the continuing depression were based on protecting industry by tariffs, encouraging investment by low interest rates, maintaining the exchange rate at a competitive $3.4, and encouraging the rationalizing, so not nationalizing, rationalizing of older industries. In terms of protection, the Abnormal Importations Act of 1931 saw a 30% duty on pottery, cutlery, and woolen and cotton goods. The Import Duties Act of 1932 extended this by placing a general tariff of 11% on all goods except food and raw materials. The Empire were not very accepting of these changes. However, the creation of the sterling area, where some Empire and Scandinavian countries agreed to tie their currency to the pound, helped avoid fluctuation in the international markets. The Special Areas Act of 1934 allocated money to depressed areas, for example, 2 million at first for Tyneside, Clydeside and South Wales plus West Cumberland, and then on top of that the Milk Act of 1934 provided milk for all young school children. And the seventh topic that we have is social policies of the national government. The national government maintained some social policies and did not entirely neglect the welfare of the people, but it was not until after the Second World War that major developments were made, which created a full welfare state and an economic policy devoted to full employment, which led to a real break with the depressed years of the 1930s. So, talking about the education and the young, you have the 1934 Milk Act, previously mentioned, and then you have the school leaving age raised to 15 in 1936, with more state children going to uni. In terms of transport, despite cheap rent and rooms, people were reluctant to leave, so that was it. But obviously there was a lot of cars on the road. Condition for workers and living standards. There were extensions of pensions in 1937, and low interest rates helped to increase the housing stock by 2.7 million properties, which assisted the policies of slum clearances. Despite this, it was unable to introduce a comprehensive health system. And then finally, the eighth kind of subsection of this is the recovery from the crash in that. Recovery did take place, though how thoroughly is questionable, given the return to recession in 1937 and the persistence of unemployment. Much was due to the development of new consumer industries and a boom in home building. After 1937, rearmament began to create enough demand in Britain's metal and textile industries to avoid a repeat of the bad years of 1931 to 32. What were the causes of recovery? Well, we have new industries, low interest rates, limited wages increase is what I meant, support for consumer spending in terms of buying in shareholders, I think, and then falling prices of food and raw materials, government aid for industries in depressed areas, and rise of agricultural production by 16% in 1930, and that is economic issues. Alright, now we're on to British domestic politics from 1929 to 1939. Okay. Let's start with the situation in 1929. There was a Labour minority government. The Liberals held the balance of power. The Conservative majority in the Lords meant they held a balance of power in that respect. The press was they had an unsympathetic press. The civil service opposed to the radical measures. In the Labour minister, In the the Labour ministers were Arthur Henderson as Foreign Secretary, J.H. Thomas as Lord Privy Seal, John Snowdon as Chancellor, and John Clines as Home Secretary, and these are all kind of like centrist people. Let's talk about increasing state control. The London Transport Bill in 1931 brought all London transport under one authority. This came into effect in 1933 under the Conservative-dominated national government. The Agricultural Marketing Act in 1931 increased controls over producers, but still was accepted and developed by Conservatives. Let's talk about what measures did Snowdon take. He sought to balance the budget and oppose the devaluation of the pound. He believed more borrowing and taxes was immoral. He put in place the Coal Mines Act of 1930, which was a part of the policy of rationalisation, which meant that which led to the Mining Industry Act in 1929. Which was a product of the Mining Industry Act of 1929, which had encouraged mine owners to amalgamate their businesses. This was a more efficient working. This promoted more efficient working and investments to cut the costs, whereas the 1930s Act had sort of the collieries divided into 21 districts, which reported to the Central Council, and it set up coal mines reorganisation commission to monitor this work. Let's talk about the domestic measures at the time. Under the second Labour government, the Housing Act of 1930 began subsidies for restored subsidies for local authorities to build more houses, to have more to follow more conservative restrictions. The Unemployment Insurance Act of 1930 increased the number of unemployed workers eligible for the transport benefit. The Road Traffic Act of 1930 introduced driving offences, which was sensible, not radical. Future Conservative Transport Minister Belisha would extend its regulations 4 years later. The economic situation by 1929 under the second Labour government. Britain was a major trading nation. By 1931, there was a catastrophic fall in world trade, which was poor for Britain, and returns on British overseas exports fell. Primary producers were hit hard by this. Industrial areas found job losses and closures from firms and factories. I'm talking about the 1931 Agricultural Marketing Act, and the things that did. Among that acts you have the Development Loan and Colonial Loan Acts of 1929, which put aside 42 million for the colonies. The crisis of 1931 was when in Austria the Credit Anstalt crashed, and then in a month's time the collapse had spread to the rest of Europe. British resources fell to 133 million, which is quite poor considering that's the national kind of expenditure by August. MacDonald was fraught with demands of 20% cuts to unemployment benefits, and people blamed Snowdon for increasing spending in the times of economic downturn. So overall, how successful were Labour's to domestic policy. It was limited and uninspiring, but had set the groundwork for future reforms and acts. Now let's talk about the national government. So let's talk about the resignation of MacDonald and the foundation of a new national government. 24th of August 1931, MacDonald resigned as Labour PM and formed a national government with Liberals, Conservatives and a small amount of Labour. The events that led to the foundation. 19th of August, the Cabinet dismissed the Cabinet discussed economics, and 56 million of 125 was considered to meet the deficit in cuts. Then on the 20th of August, MacDonald met Conservative leader Baldwin and Liberal leader John Simon about the cuts. The Trade Union Congress refused the cuts. Sidney Webb wrote to Beatrice Webb calling the Trade Union Congress pigs. As a side note, on the 21st of August, the Cabinet agreed to the cuts of 56 million. On the 22nd of August, MacDonald insisted this wasn't enough, and a compromise of 69.5 million was made. Then on the 23rd, the next day, MacDonald told the King that 78 million in cuts was necessary. Opposition leaders met the King and agreed to a coalition. So on the 23rd of August, he met again with his cabinet, and they argued an additional 10 million in cuts to be met, but only by a slim majority of like one cabinet member. So he knew, despite he had got the money, he knew it would split the Labour Party. So on the 24th of August, the King met with the party leaders, and they assured him that all three of them would support a coalition, and then the national government was formed without MacDonald informing his party or his cabinet the day later, or the same day. How national was the national government? Well, the National Economy Act was highly controversial. Despite this, it reflected the overall public opinion at the time that the deficit needed to be cut. MacDonald told the Trade Union Congress he had many letters about the unpopularity of dole spending. There were protests at Invergordon naval base in September, which led to further weight on the global the gold reserves. The government was formed to deflate the pound, take it off the gold standard. What was the impact of the national government? Huge seat losses for Labour. The Independent Labour Party was reduced to 5 seats. MacDonald no longer had to worry about the TUC. The Liberal Party had been split into 3 groups. There were fewer than 2.5 million votes, so not a lot that year. There was a lack of economic stability, which meant that neither Japan nor Germany were opposed early enough on. I'm going to talk about the abdication crisis. Edward the Eighth abdicates after planning on marrying the American divorcee Ms. Simpson. This was a controversy in which had become increasingly unlikely that Parliament would accept his marriage. He had Nazi influences. He had a lack of tax, too much popularity, which is why the parliamentary bloc would have damaged Parliament's reputation, whatever they chose to do. and MacDonald was forced to drop free trade, and he had no labour backing. Talking about the people of the national government, MacDonald was forced to drop free trade, and he had no labour backing. Baldwin wanted a modernised Labour Party, and he lost the 1929 election, and Chamberlain did the policy of appeasement and promised shuttle diplomacy, or pioneered shuttle diplomacy. Now, on political extremism, first let's talk about communists. The Communist Party of Great Britain, formed in 1920 by small socialist, Marxist and suffragette groups. Initial membership was 2,500, but this wasn't half as successful as in Germany and other places. The Communists were elected in 1922, and Wiley Gallagher was elected in 1935 into MPship. Membership rose from 10,000 in 1926 and continued to rise with unemployment. People had sympathy for the left-wing revolutionaries in Spain and disliked Hitler. Reasons for the lack of support: the party mainly consisted of the party was constrained by the official policy established by Moscow. The Labour did not accept their affiliations. It was a minority belief. It was dissembled by the 1924 Zinoviev letter, which was fake. The failure of the general strike weakened its case. It created hostility in the TUC with the creation of red unions, which were more extreme. Volunteers in the Spanish Civil War had been disgusted by the violence of the communists against other left-wing groups in the revolt. And then let's talk about fascists. The fascist dictatorship of Mussolini attracted the interest and admiration of some of the right. People liked the ideals of racial unity and Jew hatred. People liked loyalty, patriotism, community, belief in the empire and white supremacy. It produced the British Union of Fascists in 1932, and then later the New Party of Oswald Mosley following him leaving the Labour Party and all the other parties and Liberal parties in that. The Evening Standard and the Daily Mail had ran pro-black shirt articles. 1934 fascist rallies peaked at around 12,000 people. Reasons for lack of support: the Public Order Act of 1936 had banned processions, which was an integral part of fascism, so they weren't able to hold their processions. The public didn't appreciate a deliberate march through London's Jewish East End. Mosley was a weak leader, and he's too upper class, so the working class who he was trying to appeal to didn't like him. Fascism was more of a continually popular ideology on the continent rather than on British Isles. Nazi Germany was unpopular, and as a growing security threat, the British people didn't like it. Now let's talk about the fourth core of this topic, which is the impact of foreign affairs on domestic government. So, what is the growing problem of maintaining and monitoring peace? In 1931, Japan invades Chinese Manchuria. The 10-year rule was going on during this. The 10-year rule is when people say, oh, there's been a massive war, like there'll be 10 years between another one. and so they weren't prepared with their arms because they presumed that there wouldn't be another war in 10 years. Hitler came to power in 1933 and took Germany out the League of Nations. Germany started rearmament in 1935 and remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936. In 1935, Ethiopia was invaded by Italy, and no action was taken against Italy despite Ethiopia's League of Nations membership. Let's talk about the British reactions. They were slow to react in the face of German rearmament. When Baldwin retired, there was no cabinet foreign policy or coherent foreign policy. Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler 3 times in 1938 before returning with an agreement for peace, which was totally fake. Political influences on foreign policy. Public opinion was against war, even when it was suggested against Turkey in 1922. The Empire was also strongly against war. The Oxford Union Debating Society in 1933 voted against going to war for king and country. By 1937, Britain could no longer work with the League of Nations to maintain peace, and started the rearmament of the RAF. And then finally, the effects that foreign policy had on domestic policy was depressed areas received some financial support, but infant mortality were arguably lower before, and so was age of death. So yeah, because the focus on foreign policy, well-being of domestic policy went down. Alright, and that's that. And now this is the final topic that we'll be doing. This is domestic politics, 1940 to 1951. Okay, firstly, why did Chamberlain fail? The war brought about a new coalition government dominated by Winston Churchill. The government of Chamberlain had not shown itself to be very effective or dynamic in war cabinet. The lack of an offensive strategy led to the war being seen as the USA as quote-unquote phony. The first major campaign in Norway led to failure. Right, firstly, the phony war. There had been no attempts to attack Germany. Despite a small expeditionary force led by Lord Gort being sent to France, and Germany was focusing on the occupation of Poland. Chamberlain's cabinet was largely made up of appeasement supporters. And then the Norwegian campaign, Chamberlain agreed to Churchill's plan of an offensive on Norwegian waters, which the Germans used to obtain Swedish iron ore. It was argued a month after that Hitler had approved the invasion of Norway, and although 12 German ships were sunk, no real evidence could be presented for progress towards victory. The Commons debate that followed uncovered the ineffective planning. It resulted in a vote of no confidence, but Churchill took the blame and the government remained. On the 10th of May, Germany invaded Holland and Belgium, and Chamberlain received backlash and stepped down, and the king appointed Churchill on the same day. Reasons for Churchill becoming PM. The debate of the Norway campaign saw the fall of Chamberlain, but the appointment of Churchill was far from certain given his unpopularity among many MPs and his responsibility for failure in Norway. However, the refusal of Halifax to take the office meant that there was no real alternative. The events of 1940 gave him a chance to show his finest qualities as a speaker and as a leader, and he stayed in power until 1945. On the topic of the Phoney War, Churchill consistently advocated greater resistance to Germany than Chamberlain, despite British weakness at the time. He demanded vigorous action from his admirals before becoming the war leader. And in his cabinet, Churchill made a coalition cabinet in May 1940 to achieve control of Parliament, despite certain Conservative MPs not agreeing with his choice of ministers. He had the instant advantage of being right about Hitler. He had a reputation to sit as a strong and inspiring speaker. He had experience of government in wartime, in World War One, and as a colonial soldier in northwest India. The fact that he took the blame for the Norway campaign also scored him respect. There was no other well-known political leader not associated with a policy of appeasement who could win the confidence of both Labour and Conservatives. Let's talk about the effect that the war had. The war had a remarkable impact on the home front. In society and industry there were very significant developments, but the impact varied, and some changes were not carried out into post-war life. The role of women changed, but more in the short term than in the long term. The war had an impact on housing and health. After a more national healthcare system was implemented during wartime demands, it would have been harder to return to a pre-war system. Greater state controls paved the way generally for post-war changes. In terms of food, the effect the war had on food: meat, butter, and sugar were rationed in Jan 1940. Rationing was overseen by the Ministry of Food, which was newly made. Special divisions were set up, providing workplace canteens and low-cost restaurants in places that had been heavily bombed. Fines as high as £500 and 900 inspectors helped crack down on the food black market. And there were long-term health improvements. In terms of women, the Women's Royal Navy Service was re-established, and 72,000 Wrens were in the Navy. Women's conscription to national service in 1941 for children's widows, don't know what that means, and single women aged 20 to 30 was implemented, and they worked on land and factory work. Women were still paid 39% less than men, however, and also 1,300 wartime nurseries closed when the war ended. In terms of health, emergency hospital schemes were set up to deal with the normal medical cases and the new war casualties. William Beveridge recommended the NHS to government in a 1942 report. The EMS was created, which provided regional blood transfusions, specialists to public service hospitals, and 99,000 hospital beds. On top of this, the effect that war had, remarkably, there was a good deal of attention given to Reconstruction. The Beveridge Report was a best-selling recommendation for larger scale change in social security. Just how radical this change has been debated. if defined by the role of the state in taking responsibility for social security and ending poverty, if defined the role of the state in taking responsibility for the social, there was bad housing and unemployment. However, there were distinct limitations in the means suggested. Even in war, there were acts to improve British life, and the 1944 Education Act was a major advance. Whether the advance was in the right direction was debated at the time, but it set the policy of education for a vital 20 years after the war. The Beveridge Report, 1942, highly influential, suggests the NHS. The 1944 Education Act, each area in Britain to provide a varied and comprehensive education service. School leaving age raised to 15 by 1947 and 16 after that. Education to be divided into primary, secondary and tertiary. An exam at 11 to decide on the type of school that the child should attend, and then as part of the Butler Education Act. And then the belief that children could only think in abstract, concrete or mechanical terms was deeply flawed in choosing the different types of secondary school education that the child would receive. Let's talk about 1945 election result. The election result of 1945 came as a surprise, as the war-winning Churchill government was replaced by Labour under Clement Attlee, who seemed more likely to implement large-scale domestic reform. Labour achieved a 393-seat majority, but it was not more than 50% of the vote. Labour had voted for the popular Beveridge Report. Labour ministers were known for their wartime work. Attlee had been the deputy PM. Ernest Bevin had been the minister for Labour associated with the conscription into the mines, and he was later associated with the NHS. Labour had stressed the need to create a new post-war Britain and reward the dedication of the nation. Those in the army forces didn't like Churchill, as they remembered his opposition to the general strike and to trade union activities. Churchill led a negative campaign against Labour, saying that the policies would need a Gestapo to enforce. However, it was clear that Labour's moderate ministers would not be rabid socialists. And then the next subsection we got is Labour's governments between 1945 and 1951. There was a determined programme of social reform, the most significant of which was probably the creation of the NHS. Despite this, and the nationalisation of key industries, the government was criticised by the far left for not being radical enough. Labour did not institute an effective overall planning structure and did not scale down Britain's international commitments in line with the post-war economic problems. The economy had to support costly social reforms, imperial commitments and heavy defence spending. Clause 4, expectations, Clause 4 would be acted on, include the nationalisation of 20% of the economy happened, and £164.6 million was given to previous mine owners, which is seen as appeasement to the miners owners in a way. Only coal and steel were heavily nationalised. The 1946 National Insurance Act saw that sickness and unemployment benefits were made, as well as burial grants for the dead. However, it couldn't be opted out of. In terms of health, the NHS was founded in 1948 by Aneurin Bevan. 187 million free prescriptions were issued in 1948, and the private health services remained, however. In terms of education, the Butler Education Act happened, and 35,000 returners from the war became trained as teachers. However, grammar schools carried on the idea of two Englands or whatever, two Britons, the poor and the rich, and this created social barriers. Then we have Labour's achievements. Despite controls, rationing, austerity, and a major financial crisis in 1941, the devaluation of the currency in 1949, Britain did switch to peacetime production. Its exports did rise, and there was full employment. Large-scale inflation was avoided, and Britain was set for a period of prosperity after 1951. Attlee sent John Maynard Keynes to negotiate a loan from the USA during the announcement that American aid would cease from 1945. He got $3.57 billion to be paid from 1951 to 2001 back in loans. The convertibility crisis of 1949 happened. There was a lack of confidence in the pound, and occupied Germany fueled the occupied Germany fuel crisis meant that there was a gap of £438 million in imports and exports, which heavily hurt the value of the sterling pound. The following export drive made it hard for Britons to buy goods. Exports slowly rose, but it didn't close the trade gap fully. Inflation was under control, luckily. New British goods were not yet in high demand, as the rest of the world hadn't developed sufficiently yet in terms of mains and electricity to plug things into the walls. Arguments with the TUC about keeping down wages was set in place. That's about it. And then we have the reorganisation and the 1950 and 1951 election. Labour did not lose in 1951 because of a massive popular vote against it, but because the Conservatives reaped the benefit of a declining Liberal Party, better party organisation, and an undertow of middle class discontent. Despite increase in their amounts of votes in both the 1950 and 1951 elections, the decline of the Liberal Party meant that by 1951 the Conservative Party was once again in a position to control where they had enough votes to establish a government. Conservatives became united and had a campaign fund of £1 million under Lord Woolton. 17 new constituencies were formed, and this helped the Conservatives mostly. Labour had a negative campaign election against the Conservatives in 1951, and investors lost confidence in the pound, and swing Liberals mostly went to the Conservatives. And that is that.